This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Enthralling, and today I'm continuing with Zendikar Rising Limited Review Week. Throughout the next several days, I'm going to give you my thoughts on every single card in the set, going color by color. Yesterday I looked at white, today I'm looking at blue, and tomorrow I'll be looking at black. I'm also going to look at the top 10 bombs and put together an archetype guide. A few caveats before we get started on blue. This review is only for the limited format. This means draft and sealed. I'm not commenting on any other formats. Also, this review is based on my initial impressions of the cards, which means it's impossible I'll get everything right. I usually do a video where I discuss the cards I got wrong and why at the end of each format. Worth keeping in mind though, when I am wrong, I'm generally wrong because I'm underrating something and not overrating it. So, in other words, it's pretty unlikely I'm overrating anything in this video. Finally, I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each card. If you're unsure what those letter grades mean, there is an explanation in the description. Alright, let's get started with our first blue card. Our first blue card is Anti-Cognition, which for 1 generic into blue is a common instant, and it says counter target creature or planeswalker spell unless its controller pays 2 generic mana. If an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, instead counter that spell and scry 2. A counter spell has to do something extra or be really efficient to be worthwhile and limited, and I don't feel like either of those things are true here. If you've heard me talk about counterspells in Limited before, I apologize for restating it, but it is important to note. Counter magic is not removal. It's worse than removal in most cases in Limited because you have to have the mana up at the right time or it just doesn't do anything. With removal, you can generally use it whenever. Not so here. This is only 2 mana, but it's going to mostly be a bad mana leak most of the time. Adding Scry 2 if your opponent has enough cards in the graveyard isn't going to do it for me. This type of counterspell has diminishing returns as the game goes on, and it doesn't even counter non-creature spells. I'm passing on this one. I can see maybe running it in a super controlling deck, but that won't come together often enough. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, it's Beyin Veil, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant, and it says creatures your opponents control get -2/-0 until end of turn. However, it's a double-faced modal card, so in addition to being a spell, it has a land on the other side. Unlike most double-faced cards we've seen before, these don't transform. You just pick which side you want, and you play that part of the card. So, you choose between it being this Beyin Veil spell, or being Beyin Coast, which is an uncommon land, obviously, that enters the battlefield tapped and taps for 1 blue mana. These double-faced modal cards are interesting ones. In a lot of ways, they're just lands that have upside. They're cards you can play in your deck and count as a land, but can be a spell when you need them to. The spell side of this has an effect that I'm not normally a big fan of, but just like adding cycling to a card with this effect was fine in Ikoria, making it so it can also be played as a land is a real upgrade. The reason this type of effect isn't great is because it doesn't do anything or does far too little way more often than how often it actually does do something. However, when that window does open, it can do some nasty stuff, like wreck combat for your opponent. But if it's clear it's not going to be much use, you can play it as a land to get more mana, maybe even trigger landfall. The spell side of this is just a D most of the time, but by adding a land to this, I think you get a full letter upgrade, all the way up to a C. Next up, it's Bubble Snare, which for 1 blue mana is a common enchantment aura. It has Kicker for 2 generic into blue. Kicker's back in this set. Kicker means you can spend an extra amount of mana for an additional effect. It has Enchant Creature, and when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you tap that creature, and Enchanted Creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. I really like this design. Getting away with just paying 1 for this on a creature that's already tapped is going to feel really great, because it's probably going to let you play 2 spells. And when you're the more defensive player, that's probably how you'll use it, since it will enable you to do some other things on your turn. Sometimes you just need to be able to lock down any opposing creature though, and you can pay the kicker when that's necessary to get a blocker out of the way, or a creature your opponent just won't attack with that is causing you all kinds of problems. I'm trying to decide whether I think this is premium. Each version of the card would be about a C+, but having the ability to be either one might just be enough to push it into B- territory, and I think that's where I'm going to start it. Next up, it's Cascades here, which for 3 generic into blue is a 3/3 Merfolk Wizard at common. When it enters the battlefield, you scry X, where X is the number of creatures in your party, and your party consists of up to 1 each of Cleric, Rogue, Warrior, and Wizard. So this is a new mechanic in the set that looks at these 4 creature types in particular. The more of each of those you have in play, the higher your party count can be, and it can be from anything from 0 to 4. So I think this is fine. A 4-mana 3/3 that scries 1 would probably be a C-. We recently had Octoprophet, which was a 4-mana 3/3 that always scried 2, and that was a nice solid C. And I think that's what this will be most of the time. Obviously, with a full party, it gets better, but you shouldn't really look at this as doing that very often, because it won't. When evaluating these, you have to come to a conclusion about what you think is the most likely outcome, and that average is probably about 1.5, scrying about 1.5 when you play this, and yeah, that's a C. Next up, it's Cheryx, the Raging Isle, who for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 0/17, yes, I said 17, legendary creature Leviathan Crab at rare. And it says spells your opponents cast that target it cost 2 more to cast, and you can pay 3 generic to give it +X -X until end of turn, where X is the number of islands you control. So this is pretty good. A 4-mana 0/17 that makes people pay extra mana to use removal on it would probably be like a C+, like even if it could never attack, just because something that size will really be a hindrance to your opponent on the ground. But then you add in the activated ability, which lets it actually be a good attacker and a blocker that can kill opposing attackers, and I think you have a really good card on your hands. It's definitely a silly meme card, and sometimes you're going to play it and have like 2 islands, and that ability won't be that impressive, but it's still going to be pretty good. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Chilling Trap, which for 1 blue mana is a common instant, and it says target creature gets -4/-0 until end of turn. If you control a wizard, draw a card. I am never very into these effects that just lower a creature's power. A lot of the time, they are effectively fogs. They don't result in you trading for a card the majority of the time, and you can't really have too many cards like that in your deck. We saw something similar with Beguine Veil. It's just hard to make a creature win combat with it. Mostly, you're just helping your creature survive combat, which means you're going down a card. The Wizard clause here does matter because it makes it so that not trading when you use it doesn't matter since it replaces itself. It's also a cheap spell, which the Wizard deck does care about, but I still see myself cutting this way more often than I play it. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Cleric of Chill Depths, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 Merfolk Cleric at common, and when it blocks a creature, that creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Look, it's a creature that's a really good chump blocker. Unfortunately, that's not really the kind of card you'll want most of the time. If you need a 2-drop and you're trying to get there on party, I could see playing this, but I think most of the time, you're hoping you don't play this. It just doesn't do enough to be worth a card, giving it a D+. Next up, it's Concerted Defense, which for 1 blue mana is an uncommon instant, and it says counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 1, plus an additional 1 for each creature in your party. A 1-mana counterspell certainly piques my interest. One of the downsides of counterspells is that you have to leave up mana and hope your opponent plays into them the way you want them to, and while that's still true with a 1-mana counterspell, it's much less punishing to be unable to use since you're only leaving up a single mana, something that just happens organically all the time. This is basically a more narrow force spike on its own, and it gets better the more party members you have, which basically means it will get better in the later parts of the game. Sort of. Keep in mind, your opponent will also have mana in the later part of the game, so it's probably kind of a wash. And it only works on non-creature spells. This is an interesting card to look at because I'm genuinely uncertain if it does enough to be worth playing in Limited. Countering only non-creature spells is sort of a downside, but most decks have enough of them that it will be easy to find targets for it, and oftentimes your opponent's non-creature spells are removal, which are among the best cards in their deck. But I still don't think this is a card you'll find yourself going after hard or anything like that. I want to start it at a C-, but like I said, there's a lot of uncertainty here. Next up, it's Confounding Conundrum, which for 1 generic and a blue is a rare enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and it says whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player has another land enter the battlefield under their control this turn, they return a land they control to its owner's hand. This is an interesting design, since at worst, it's a blank card with cycling. I think it does avoid being a straight-up F. That said, even in a set with a bunch of landfall, the additional text on this card just won't come up much. And honestly, you might actually help your opponent trigger landfall more, even if they can return lands. This seems like a card that was printed to hinder ramp decks in Constructed, and not a card that was printed with Limited in mind. Sometimes you will maybe wreak havoc on your opponent who's trying to do some silly things, but most of the time, it's just 2 mana to draw a card and nothing else. That's a D. Next up, it's Coral Helm Chronicler, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 Merfolk Wizard at rare, and it says whenever you cast a kicked spell, draw a card, then discard a card, and when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a card with a kicker ability from among them and put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Seems like most of the time you're going to hit a card with the commander, especially in a blue-green deck, which is the color pair that is the kickeriest. You definitely need to have a few cards with kicker, but something like 5 or 6 will be enough to draw a card most of the time. Looting anytime you kick is also quite nice, as it helps you rip through your deck and find relevant cards more effectively. I think this will be a 3-mana 2/2 that draws you a card and loots a few times in most games, and right now, I think that's enough to push this into the lower range of first pickable. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Cunning Geyser Mage, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 3/2 human wizard at common. It has kicker for 2 generic and a blue, and when it enters the battlefield, if you kicked it, it returns up to 1 other target creature to its owner's hand. This isn't quite Roaming Ghostlight, right? But it seems alright. Early, it can be a not completely horrible 3-mana 3/2, and in the later part of the game, you can pay 6 for a 3/2 that bounces something. That rate is admittedly not great, but anytime you can add to the board while subtracting from your opponents feels pretty good. While good mana ward type creatures are usually first pickable, I think this falls a little short of that. I think it's more like a C+. I bet a lot of you are surprised I didn't give it an A+, as much as I tend to like cards like this, but it's just not efficient enough for me. Next up, it's Deliberate, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant that says scry 2, then draw a card. So, this is pretty similar to Anticipate, though it's likely a little bit better. It's an instant speed preordain, another way to look at it as well, except it costs twice as much. You get to see up to 3 cards when you use it, and if you happen to have 2 things on top of your library you really want, you can leave them both there, which, like, Anticipate can't. And if you don't want either, well, you can smooth out your draws and get rid of them. You get the picture. This kind of card, though, is very replaceable. The main thing it can do is increase the consistency of your deck, and while that's nice, it isn't something that will always make it into your deck, though it is probably going to be fairly appealing in blue-red decks. I think overall it's a C-. Next up, it's Expedition Diviner, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/2 Merfolk Wizard at common. It's got flying, and it says whenever you control another wizard, Expedition Diviner has, when this creature dies, draw a card. This is a pretty good common. A 4-mana 3/2 flyer with the wizard creature type would probably be at least a C-, and maybe even a C. Those stats are reasonable enough. But by adding the draw a card wizard payoff, you end up with a card that will be a 2-for-1 a decent chunk of the time, and I like that. This seems like a good common, though not quite in the first pickable range, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Field Research, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common sorcery, and it has kicker for 2 generic and a blue. When you cast it, you draw 2 cards, and if it was kicked, you draw 3 instead. So on a base level, this is Divination, a card that is a decent playable in most limited formats, somewhere between a C- and a C. But this becomes more powerful in the late game, drawing you 3 cards if you have the spare mana around to do it. Now, 6 mana at sorcery speed to draw 3 cards is very clunky, but it's attached to what is already a reasonable card, which means being able to cast it with kicker is all upside, the kind of upside you get to use if you're flooding out. I think the first copy of this will find its way into most blue decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Glacial Grass, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant. It says tap target creature. Its controller mills 2 cards. That creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Draw a card. It seems like this set has a bunch of common cards that are strictly better versions of older ones. We've seen this effect or something similar on several cards, like Crippling Chill, but this adds milling to the mix, which matters a bit for the blue-black deck especially. In general, this type of effect is usually a little bit better in more aggressive decks, because the card tends to take away 2 times the card could have blocked and only 1 time it could have attacked. A card like that can really tamper with Erase and swing it in your favor. Now, it is pretty situational, and if you use it defensively, it's generally worse, but adding a cantrip to the mix makes a difference, since it won't quite feel like you were casting Fog if the card replaces itself. Still, I don't generally think you want more than 1 of these, and they tend to be an easy cut. I think that means it's a C-. Next up, it's Glasspool Mimic, which for 2 generic and a blue is a shapeshifter rogue at rare. It's a 0/0, but it can enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature you control, except it's a shapeshifter rogue in addition to its other types. It's one of these double-faced modal cards, though, and on the other side there's a land called Glasspool Shore, and it enters the battlefield tapped, and it can be tapped for blue mana. Clones are nice, and while this can only copy your creatures, paying 3 to get a copy of your best creature will very frequently be a good deal. It also holds on to the rogue creature type, and there's some nice upsides to go with that. If this was just the clone side, I think it would be pretty close to a B-. Sometimes though, a clone, especially one that only copies your creatures, isn't really what you need, and when that happens, well, you can play it as the land. The upside here is nice. I think she is an easy B, something you first pick most of the time. Next up, it's Inscription of Insight, which for 3 generic and a blue is a rare sorcery. It has Kicker for 2 generic and 2 blue, and it says choose one. If this spell was kicked, choose any number instead. And the options are, return up to 2 target creatures to their owner's hand, scry 2, then draw 2 cards, and target player creates an XX blue illusion creature token, where X is the number of cards in their hand. So the inscriptions are all pretty nice. As a 4-mana spell, bouncing 2 creatures is actually a reasonable deal, even if it is a sorcery. That card would probably be a C, maybe even a C+. It's just going to give you a pretty nice tempo advantage. Paying 4 to scry 2 and draw 2 cards is usually a fine card too. Another C or C+. The last option is not going to be good very often if that's what you choose, but hey, it can give you a creature if that's what you really need. I feel like a card with those 3 options would be pretty close to a B- without the kicker upside. With the kicker upside, which will give you all 3 of these things, it's certainly better than that. Sure, kicking this is kind of hard at 8 mana, but when you do, it's going to be pretty devastating. I think you can first pick this most of the time when you see it. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Into the Royal, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant. It has Kicker for 1 generic and a blue, and it says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. If this spell was kicked, draw a card. We've seen this before, and it was a pretty great common for blue. 2 mana for an instant that bounces non-land permanents is already a playable card in Limited, usually like a C. Adding Kicker here is just great, because if you kick it, Into the Royal goes from being a card that gives you some tempo to being a card that actually trades for a whole card and gives you tempo. And obviously, as an instant, you can sometimes blow out auras or combat tricks too. I think this is an easy inclusion in any blue deck, and you are probably happy with multiples. It is a little bit short of first pickable though, but I'm going to give it a C+. Next up, it's Jace Mirrormage, who for 1 generic and 2 blue is a legendary Planeswalker Jace at Mythic Rare. Starts with 4 loyalty, and he has a kicker for 2 colorless mana. And when he enters the battlefield, if he was kicked, you create a token that's a copy of him, but it's not legendary, and its starting loyalty is 1. He has a +1 that says scry 2, and a 0 loyalty ability that says draw a card and reveal it. Remove a number of loyalty counters equal to that card's converted mana cost from Jace Mirrormage. This is an interesting card to unpack. If he was just a Planeswalker without kicker, it seems like he would be a pretty okay card. Hitting lands with his 0 ability will feel particularly nice, because it will really allow you to net more cards. Still, I think it's unlikely he draws you more than 2 cards most of the time because he doesn't do anything to protect himself. And sure, you can scry with him too to set up the 0 ability, but most of the time you're just going to want to go for cards and not scry. You just don't have the time. So without kicker, he's probably just a C, sort of a convoluted divination. Adding the kicker does matter though, because that makes it so that you are likely to draw 3 cards off of him. And sure, 5 to draw 3 over a couple of turns isn't amazing, but it is additional flexibility that you can sink mana into if you draw him late. Still, I'm not super into this version of Jace for Limited. He doesn't protect himself, and the upside isn't that impressive. I'm not sure I want to first pick him most of the time. I'm giving him a C+. Next up, it's Jowari Disruption, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant. It says counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. And it's one of those double-faced modal cards. Its other side is Jowari Ruins, which is a land that enters the battlefield tapped and can be tapped for blue mana. This seems pretty good to me. It isn't that far from being Censor, a card with the same effect and cost of Jowari Disruption, but it has cycling instead of a land on the other side. But what makes Censor a nice card in Limited also makes this nice. Counterspells can be problematic, as we've said. You take a tempo hit by leaving up mana, and that gets even truer about a card like this, which gets worse as the game goes on since your opponent having that extra mana is likely. However, once you reach that point of the game, you can just play this as a land, and that is some nice upside. Is it as good as cycling? Maybe. It remains to be seen, but right now I think it's pretty close. This basically gets around all the downsides of counterspells by being mana when you need it to be, and you still have the upside of really getting your opponent with this while that is more likely to occur. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Living Tempest, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 3/3 elemental at common with flash and flying. This is a functional reprint of cards like Stormrider, Spirit, and Windstrider, and those cards were probably slightly better because both of them had creature types that had a tribal archetype in those formats, and Living Tempest does not. That said, it's still pretty decent. Flash has some serious upside for any deck looking to cast expensive instants or hold up activated abilities, and even if you don't have that stuff going on, this is large enough that it can flash in and gobble up a 2/2 or something like that, and then threaten the opponent from the skies. It isn't special, it's a solid playable, though I think generally speaking, you probably are hoping to get enough better 5-drops that you don't play more than one of these. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Mages Domination, which for X mana and 3 blue is an uncommon sorcery. It costs 3 less to cast if it targets a creature whose controller has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, and you can gain control of target creature with converted mana cost X. So let's ignore the cost reduction effect on this for a moment and evaluate how good this is without it. Mind control effects are hugely powerful because they allow you to take your opponent's creature and add it to your own board, effectively giving you a 2-for-1. This one is costly, and the triple blue is no joke either, but paying 6 to steal a 3 mana card or 7 to steal a 4 mana card is still a really good rate. Obviously, if you have enough mana, it can steal just about anything, but you can't really count on that. I would say without the cost reduction clause here, this is probably already a B-. Stealing cards is just that powerful, even when it's this inefficiently. With the cost reduction clause, I definitely think it gets to be a B. The blue-black deck is about milling, and that's where this will cost 3 less. I would guess if you're playing this in a blue-black deck, you'll probably be able to reduce the cost of it once or twice across all of your matches. If it was always 3 mana cheaper to steal stuff, it would be like an A. But yeah, I don't think you'll be getting there often enough that it's that good, but I do have it as a B, a very powerful uncommon that you first pick most of the time when you see it. Next up, it's Maddening Cacophony, which for 1 generic and a blue is a rare sorcery with kicker for 3 generic and a blue, and it says each opponent mills 8 cards. If this spell was kicked, instead each opponent mills half their library, rounded up. In most formats, I wouldn't think this was all that great, but this format has what appears to be a very real mill deck, as the blue-black rogue archetype has it as its sub-theme, and in fact, the sub-theme specifically checks to see if an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, like we just saw. And this gets that done with a single card. Then if you kick this, it traumatizes your opponent, which is pretty cool. Though honestly in Limited, most of the time I think you're just going to cast this for the 2 mana, especially in the early game, to turn on cards like Mages Domination. Still, it is upside attached to a card that's already worthwhile. So, thanks to a very real mill archetype and one that cares about 8 cards specifically, I think this is actually pretty nice. I don't quite know if I want to be first picking it. It depends on just how real that blue-black deck is, but for now, I would say this is something I would prefer to pick up after having a few of those cards already. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Master of Winds, who for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 1/4 Sphinx Wizard at rare. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw 2 cards and then discard a card. And whenever you cast an instant sorcery or wizard spell, you may have its base power and toughness become 4/1 or 1/4 until end of turn. I like this a lot. A 4 mana 1/4 flyer that draws you 2 and discards a card would be a C+ at worst. It's better than an enter the battlefield ability that draws you a single card. While you still only net 1 card, you get card selection that you just don't have with a normal cantrip. Then you add the spells and wizards upside, and this gets a lot sweeter since it can suddenly start hitting harder in the air. I think this is quite good and first pickable most of the time when you see it. I'm giving this Sphinx a B. Next up, it's Merfolk Falconer, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 4/4 Merfolk Wizard at uncommon. It's got flying, and whenever you cast a kicked spell, you scry 2. So, Air Elemental is usually a B- all on its own. 5/4 a 4/4 flyer are stats that still line up really good these days, representing a real threat even if nothing else is going on. Then this lets you scry when you kick spells, and that's some real upside. I'm not sure if it's enough to really elevate the Falconer above that B- level though. It is obviously strictly better than Air Elemental, so while the Elemental is like an 80 B-, the Falconer is more like an 82, but I think this is still a B-, meaning it's a card you'll take pretty early. Next up, it's Merfolk Wind Robber, which for 1 blue mana is a 1/1 Merfolk Rogue at uncommon. It has flying, and when it deals combat damage to a player, that player mills a card. You can also sacrifice it to draw a card, but you can only use that ability if your opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. 1 mana 1/1 flyers with upside are nice. That stat line alone is often not enough as it gets outclassed quickly, but if you play it early, it will get in for a few damage. The Wind Robber gets around that by having some late game utility, where you can just sacrifice it to draw a card. Your opponent won't always be getting to 8 cards in their graveyard, but in the Rogue deck it will happen, and the Robber can help you get there often enough that you will be drawing a card with this from time to time. This is a solid card for blue decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Negate, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant, and it says counter target non-creature spell. We've seen this a lot. Negate is not as good in limited as in constructed for the most part, as pretty much every deck has way more creature spells than non-creature spells. That said, most decks will have 5 or so, but that is enough that it won't be completely dismal in your main deck, and hey, at least it's a hard counter. I think it is a D+ if you have to play it in your main deck, and a C+ out of your sideboard. Next up, it's Nimble Trap Finder, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 human rogue at rare, and it can't be blocked if you add another cleric, rogue, warrior, or wizard into the battlefield under your control this turn, and it has another ability. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you have a full party, creatures you control gain. Whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card until end of turn. So a 2 mana 2/1 that can't be blocked a decent chunk of the time is solid. I'm a little skeptical of the rest of this card, as I am all the full party cards. I just can't imagine full party is something you'll be assembling very often in limited. I would estimate that part of the card matters around 10% of the time. And yeah, that's some real upside to be sure, but I don't think we can really give it a huge boost to its grade for having such a difficult to achieve upside. I think it's just a C+. Next up, it's Risen Riptide, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 0/5 elemental at common, and whenever you cast a kicked spell, its base power and toughness become 5/5 until end of turn. This seems okay. One thing I don't like about a lot of these kicker payoffs is that they don't say when you cast a spell with kicker, they say when you cast a kicked spell, which obviously means you only get the trigger when you actually kick something. Perhaps it being all spells with kicker would be too good, but I have a feeling it just being spells that aren't kicked isn't going to be good enough for a card like Risen Riptide. Sure, as a 3 mana 0/5, it blocks reasonably well until it can rumble, and you can even play a kicked instant to have it become a 5/5 and block attackers and kill them too, but I still don't see myself triggering this enough to warrant inclusion in any deck apart from those very much focused on kicker, giving this a C-. Next up, it's Roost of Drakes, which for 1 blue mana is an uncommon enchantment. It has kicker for 2 generic and a blue, and when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you create a 2/2 blue drake creature token with flying, and whenever you cast a kicked spell, you create a 2/2 blue drake creature token with flying. Well, if you can get this going, this is my kind of kicker payoff. Generating multiple 2/2 drakes with this is no joke. That's the kind of air force that turns the tide of games. And I like that you can play it early on just for that ability. And if you get it later, you can actually use it to add to the board. In that case, it's basically a 4 mana 2/2 flyer with this really great kicker upside. And actually, it's a little better than that because even if the drake dies, you still have the kicker payoff lying around. I think there is enough good kicker in this set for a payoff like this to be really good. It does need something of a build-around grade, but I have a feeling even in a deck that just has like 5 cards with kicker, it's probably a C because it still has that plan of being a 4 mana 2/2 flyer. In a deck that really gets there on kicker, it's probably a B. For me, that means this is worth taking a risk on early. Next up, it's Ruin Crab, which for 1 blue mana is a 0/3 crab at uncommon, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent mills 3 cards. So, for limited purposes, this is just a better head-drawn crab. The original landfall crab can also mill you if you wanted to, but you're not doing that most of the time in limited anyway. I think Ruin Crab seems nice, and is certainly the kind of card that can enable an entire mill archetype, kind of like Teferi's Tutelage in M21. The difference is, the blue-black deck in this format is a real mill deck. It's not something just supported by one card like Tutelage. And sure, Tutelage on its own is stronger than Ruin Crab on its own, But the fact is, Ruin Crab will not be on its own. It will have other cards that will help you mill, especially in blue-black. It also blocks reasonably well as a 1-mana 0/3 while you mill your opponent. And hey, you know, the nice thing about this format too, as we've seen on several cards, is that milling, which normally only helps you out if your opponent finally runs out of cards from it, actually is relevant earlier than that because of all the cards that care about there being 8 cards in the graveyard that have been milled. Well, they don't even have to be milled, but you know what I mean. 8 cards in the graveyard gives you some nice effects. So I think Ruin Crab is actually going to be first pickable in this format in some weaker packs. It does have a severe downside of, you know, you get it late and it's just a 1-mana 0/3 and you don't have time to mill anybody with it. But I think it has enough upside that I'm willing to give it a B-. Next up, it's Seagate Restoration, which for 4 generic and 3 blue is a mythic rare sorcery, and it says draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand plus 1. You have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. It's one of these double-faced modal cards, and its other side is Seagate Reborn, and it comes into play tapped unless you pay 3 life, and it can add blue mana. I'm kind of disappointed at how situational the spell side of this is. The fact it's super expensive should have been enough to get an ability that has a slightly better baseline, but it really doesn't. Sometimes you'll draw this in top deck mode and it's going to feel really bad. Still, it is basically a land that can really expensively draw you some cards late, with the upside of maybe drawing you a ton of cards. And I think that still does enough with the flexibility it offers as a double-faced card that you can consider first picking this in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Seagate Stormcaller, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 human wizard at mythic rare. It has kicker for 4 generic and a blue. When it enters the battlefield, you copy the next instant or sorcery spell with converted mana cost 2 or less. You cast this turn when you cast it. If Seagate Stormcaller was kicked, copy that spell twice instead. You may choose new targets for the copies. Well, this is kind of a fixed Snapcaster Mage. It's a 2-mana 2/1 that lets you double a spell. In this case, the spell has to be quite cheap, but there are enough cheap instants and sorceries in this set that making this work won't be that hard. Obviously, if you kick it, you get 2 copies of that spell, but you also just spent 7 mana, so having an additional 1 or 2 mana lying around is no guarantee. And if you top deck this late, it might be nothing more than a 2/1. But that's the fail case, so that's not completely horrible. I think you will be able to make use of the spell copying ability often enough and limited that I'm interested in first picking this in some weaker packs, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Seafloor Stalker, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/3 Merfolk Rogue at common, and for 4 generic and a blue, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn and can't be blocked this turn. This ability costs 1 less to cast for each creature in your party. This seems alright. A 3-mana 2/3 isn't so good, and paying 4 to make it unblockable and give it a power boost does mean it stays relevant in the late game, but that's not exactly an efficient ability either. Obviously, the upside here comes with the idea that you can be paying even less. Paying 3 or 2 for the boost is much better, and obviously turning this into blue fire breathing with a full party is kind of funny. But with the stats it has, it is barely relevant early. And sure, if you have a full party, it will get silly, but I imagine this will cost 3 or 4 to activate most of the time, and that's fine, but also nothing special. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Shell Shield, which for 1 blue mana is a common instant with kicker for 1 generic mana, and it says target creature you control gets +0/+3 until end of turn. If this spell was kicked, that creature also gains hexproof until end of turn. How good this card is will definitely be determined by how fast of a format this is. If this format's really aggressive, a card like Shell Shield can be a blowout, since it saves your creature from removal and gives you a huge tempo boost. Sometimes +0/+3 alone can help you just win in combat, though it won't accomplish that most of the time. The real value here will be in kicking it, though having the unkicked option is of course upside. I would guess that this format is going to be somewhat fast, and I think that means if you're in a more aggressive blue deck, you probably play the first of these most of the time, but one has to remember that it is kind of narrow, and drawing this can really suck in a lot of situations, so you probably shouldn't run more than 1 copy. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Salundi Vision, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant. It says look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal an instant or sorcery card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And it's one of these modal double-faced cards. The other side is Salundi Isle, which is a land that enters the battlefield tapped and can tap for blue mana. So one side of this is a decent card selection spell, provided you have enough instants and sorceries in your deck. And the other side, of course, is a land. Like most of these, one side is kind of inefficient and or narrow, while the other side is a land, and while that might not sound too great, like all of these, it's better than it looks. And it isn't like you need a ton of instants and sorceries to make the spell side worth it. Top 6 cards is a lot. You could have 4 or 5 and have this be a land with upside. And again, this is effectively a land with upside. It does come into play tapped, but it will be more positive to have a land that can be a spell than it will be negative that it comes into play tapped. This is a C+. Next up, it's Sky Clave Plunder, which for 4 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery. It says look at the top X cards of your library, where X is 3 plus the number of creatures in your party. Put 3 of those cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This seems pretty good to me. A 5 mana draw 3 spell as a sorcery is usually a decent card in Limited, though if a format is really fast, it is a pretty big risk to take. Adding the party upside here is really nice because it gives you some card selection. Even just having 1 party member will be nice here, and I think anything beyond that will feel great. I really want this to be a first pickable card in this format, but I just don't think it's wise to assume that about a 5 mana sorcery that does not immediately add to the board. It won't really be a card you ever play more than 1 of because having 2 of these in a hand is a pretty big liability. In the end, I think this tops out at a C+. Next up, it's Sky Clave Squid, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 3/2 squid at common. It has Defender, and it has a landfall trigger that makes it lose Defender until end of turn. So, a 2 mana 3/2, even if it could attack all the time, isn't that incredible and limited. Don't get me wrong, that's obviously better than a 2 mana 2/2, but in this day and age, a vanilla Grizzly Bear is a C- at best and probably more like a D+. Adding 1 power is better, but it isn't so efficient that it doesn't still die to pretty much all the 2-drops in combat. I think that at best, a 2 mana 3/2 that could always attack and block would be a C+, and even that might be generous. This means that this, which won't quite always be attacking, but certainly will be on turn 3 most of the time, is just a C for me. Next up, it's Sure-Footed Infiltrator, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 2/3 Merfolk Rogue at uncommon. You can tap another untapped rogue you control to make it unblockable, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. I like this a lot. I always like these sort of infiltration creatures that draw you a card when they do damage, because they can really snowball. The more cards you draw, the more likely you'll be able to find a way to keep getting in with this, and in this case, the more likely you are to find rogues who can help make it unblockable. This is going to be the kind of uncommon that will take over games if your opponent can't kill it, and I think that makes this first pickable at least some of the time. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Tazim Royal Mage, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 Merfolk Wizard at common, and when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. A 2 mana 2/1 is a D+ at best these days. We just expect better stats for a 2 mana investment. Playing this as a 6 mana 2/1 that returns an instant or sorcery is some nice upside to have, but it's not incredibly efficient. Look, it has the wizard creature type and is a spell payoff, so it's going to be fine, but not much more than that. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Thieving Skydiver, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 Merfolk Rogue at rare. It has Kicker for X generic mana, it has Flying, and when it enters the battlefield, if you kicked it, you get to gain control of target artifact with converted mana cost X or less. If that artifact is an equipment, you attach it to Thieving Skydiver. So, a 2 mana 2/1 flyer tends to be pretty solid, at least a C, but this comes with some real upside, since if you kick it, you can steal artifacts. This set isn't filled to the brim with artifacts. If it were, this would be an A, but I think there are enough artifacts, including equipment that equips to itself for free, that this will probably manage to steal you an artifact once or twice during a draft, and that's some good upside on an efficient evasive creature. I think that's enough that I want to first pick this in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Umaro Wizard, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 4/3 Merfolk Wizard at uncommon, and whenever you cast an instant sorcery or wizard spell, it gains flying until end of turn. It's one of these double-faced modal cards, and its other side is Umaro Skyfalls. It's a land that enters the battlefield tapped, but can tap for blue mana. As I've already said, I really like these. The flexibility is great, knowing that if you draw this when you're flooding out, you have a spell, and if your mana's screwed, you have a land. It's just a great feeling. It's nice to know you have these lands that have really, really big upside, and you can count these as lands in your deck, but you don't always have to treat them as lands when you draw them, and that is very nice. The creature side here is actually a pretty reasonable card, since it will have flying pretty frequently in a blue-red deck. I think you can take this card with the first pick in some weaker packs between having a pretty nice creature on one side and the modality of having a land on the other side, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Windrider Wizard, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 human wizard at uncommon. It's got flying, and whenever you cast an instant sorcery or wizard spell, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. These days, a 3-mana 2/2 flyer is a C- on its own, and this has a pretty strong ability. These triggers that are going to work on instant sorceries and wizards are going to be pretty easy to make happen. You can have 10 cards in your deck that trigger them, and that's not far-fetched. So this looting for you a few times, in addition to reasonable stats and having a useful creature type, is a pretty reasonable expectation. I think this is another card you can first pick early on, giving it a B-. And our last blue card is Zulaport Duelist, which for 1 blue mana is a 1/1 human rogue at common. It has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, up to 1 target creature gets -2/-0 until end of turn, and its controller mills 2 cards. I've been impressed with similar cards in the past, like Fairy Duelist, but I don't think this is quite as good. The Duelist had flying and was a 1/2. That meant it could take down a much wider variety of things all on its own by flashing into play. Now, that doesn't mean this Duelist is bad or anything, just saying it won't live up to the hype if you think it will be as good as Fairy Duelist. Even if it isn't, it is a lot of action for a single mana, and on its own, it will be able to take down 2 1s just by flashing in and blocking, and that will certainly come up. With some help, it does an even better job since you can set up a double block and then really mess up your opponent's combat math by flashing it in. There are some cards that will also like a party member coming down at instant speed, and of course milling a couple cards is great too. There's just a lot going on here with this 1-drop. I think it's a C+. Well, those are all the blue cards in Zendikar Rising. Tomorrow I'll be back with all my thoughts on black cards. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch the rest of this set review, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to see the other review videos that are already up, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.